This video is about addressing biases and how that leads to character development. So first of all, what are biases? Biases, just the plural of the word bias. A bias is kind of the concept of favoring one thing over another and kind of it being irrational why you're favoring that thing. Quick example would be I love Rhodesian Ridgebacks as a dog breed over Australian Shepherds because I own a Rhodesian Ridgeback. So, you know, it's not to say that you favoring it is right or wrong, it's just, you know, you're biased about it. So specifically, how these biases exist in our movement. So what does it mean to have a movement bias? Well, essentially, having a movement bias comes from having a weakness in the way you move. Fundamentally, your movement pattern is wrong. It's inefficient. A movement disease, if you want to call it that. How do we get these? In my case, I developed one from traumatic injury as a kid. I did a lot of stuff that was high impact on my spine. I had a couple serious injuries that really did me in pretty good on my lower back, and that led to me moving the wrong way. I would stretch and do a lot of things with a rounded back, and over time you start to compensate in certain ways until you reach that threshold where a serious injury happens, and that did for me serious back injury. So why do these exist? Like I said, injury, it can be from something traumatic like that, or it can be something gradual. If you wake up at 7 a.m. every day, you go to work, drive to work, get there at 8, you do desk work where you're sitting, for another 8 hours, and you get off work at 5 and you drive home, sit, you eat dinner sitting, you sit on the couch, and you go to bed and you stay still. If you never move, your body's going to adapt to that. So adaptation is not biased. You're going to get better at whatever you spend the majority of your time doing. So if you spend the majority of your time not moving, you're going to get better at not moving. If you spend the majority of your time moving, obviously you'll get better at moving. So when we sit for a long time, or we don't move, to get more efficient at the lifestyle that your body's adapting to, your muscles will tighten up. Your soft tissue will get a little bit weaker because it doesn't need to put energy into having strong tissue. So, you can develop these biases from a number of ways. Why are they bad to have? So, the way the body works, if one area of the body is compromised, it's going to look to another area of the body to compensate for that. It can be range of motion in a joint, it can be flexibility, strength in a muscle, maybe even an organ. If you lose your vision, your other senses might get better to compensate for that. So, for example, shoulder range of motion. Just so you can see my spine real quick while I do this. So, to have full shoulder range of motion, if I stay with neutral spine, meaning that my spine is not in flexion and not in extension, if I'm right here and I try and go through my range of motion with my shoulders, we've got 90 degrees right here, and we've got up straight at 180 degrees, and then a little bit further. If your shoulders don't have full mobility or range of motion, what's going to happen is, to compensate for that, when you get to right about here, wherever your mobility ends, it's going to steal mobility from a nearby joint. That nearby joint being the thoracic section of your spine. You've got cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccyx. So when you get to here, all of a sudden you're going to go into thoracic extension in order to accomplish that missing range of motion in your movement. So, why is that bad? Well, if you look at a movement pattern like that in your training, might be overhead press or something like that. If every time you go to do, overhead dumbbell press and you are looking for 180 degrees above your head and you miss that range of motion, you're going to be arching your spine, and all of a sudden you're going to be putting a lot of weight in a fashion on your body that it shouldn't be. It's going to wear and tear, it's going to lead to injury. It's not going to be good. So before we start doing weight training and stuff like that, we have to take the time to identify what our movement biases are. Is your posterior chain, the rear muscles on your lower body, are they tight? Because I had a back injury, I neglected my lower half for a long time, and my lower half tightened up on me, and all of a sudden I had horrible pain in my lower back for forever, until I identified it and addressed it and adapted my training to make up for that. So, like, if you're missing your range of motion in your shoulders, you want to be sure on your movements, or adapt your training so that don't fail to address that movement bias. If you're going to do a pull-up, don't stop right here and then go back up. That's failing to address it. Go all the way down, hit that 180 degrees, and then go back up. Isokinetics. Iso meaning isolated, nothing changes. Kinetic meaning the velocity. So when an exercise is called an isokinetic exercise, the velocity in which you're doing the movement doesn't change. So a lot of times in our movement practices, you have a burst, a point in the movement pattern where you're the strongest, and you're going to burst through that specific range of motion. And what that does is it gives you momentum to get through the parts of the movement where you might not be strong, or you might have a weakness. So, if I'm strong here with my pull-up, here with my pull-up, but really weak at the top end, I might be, bursting, and the momentum from the bottom end of the movement is going to carry me through that weak point. Whereas if I do implement what's called an isokinetic movement, 10 seconds, 10 counts up, pause, 10 counts down. So from the very bottom of the movement, real slow, through to the top. I wasn't counting for that, but so the load, the work through that movement is distributed evenly throughout the entire movement. You're not failing to address any of those potential biases. So yeah, you want to address your movement weaknesses. Biases are just weaknesses, so address your weaknesses. So kind of one of my favorite things to do is to take a concept. I love movement. I've always enjoyed this kind of stuff. So I like to take concepts that I learn and develop through movement practices and apply them into a different dimension or realm, or whatever you choose to label it. So right now we just talked about how your biases in your physical movement in that realm can be harmful or detrimental to your character. Traditionally, your biases are going to exist up here in your head with the way that you think. So, for example, if, let's say, I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth and I always had $1 million at my disposal. Growing up, I never learned the value of hard work and what it took to provide for myself. You know, as soon as I'm out on my own in the real world, is it a rational thought to think that I'm going to be competent with providing for myself? No, definitely not. I mean, it's not to say that's not possible, but it's not likely. Same thing with your movement patterns. If you never stretch, your body's going to, if you never move, your body's going to fail when you try to move. So what's cool is the same way when I go through range of motion and I fall short and my shoulder stability or my shoulder mobility robs my spine for mobility, it relies on my spine to compensate for that. We do that through our relationships with people. You know, if I don't know how to make money and I don't know how to navigate the real world, I'm going to gravitate toward people or relationships or friends or romantic partners or whatever it might be. I'm going to be attracted to someone who knows how to do that. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if it perpetuates your weaknesses, then that could be a recipe for disaster. So rather than relying on that partner or relying on your thoracic spine to compensate for your weakness, use it as a tool, identify it, and develop and make your weaknesses stronger. It's a great concept. So yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it. Thanks